Hey everyone, I love D&D, and 5th edition is my favorite edition, by far. But that doesn't mean it's perfect, and I think we all agree a few adjustments could make things even better. I've done a series of those adjustments, and they are free for you. If you want to go to the video description, you will find links to the document I'm talking about today, as well as links to all the other documents I've done up to now. If you've had trouble seeing these documents, then you will find that if you go to my WordPress account, I've already put them all in PDF form, so they'll be easy for you to download and print for yourself. We've already talked about classes and races and cantrips, and now we're going to get into the leveled spells. And I'm going to begin with first level spells today, and then we will be moving each week to a new level of spells until we've completed all the spells in the Player's Handbook. As always, these documents are only covering Player's Handbook material, so if there are spells in other source books that you want me to review, let me know in the comments down below, but I do intend to get to the other source books once the Player's Handbook is complete. Now, I've heard from many of you that you want to use these variants or you are starting to use these variants. If you do use these variants, please let me know about your experience using them. I'm going to be using them myself once they're complete as in order to play test them. And hopefully then, once we've had some play testing and we've gotten some feedback, I'll look at some final revisions and see if there's a way I can make this available in a more comprehensive form. So for now, view this material as playtest material. So that out of the way, let's talk about first level spells, the Treantmonk Variant. Let's get started. So these are the first level spells, the Treantmonk Variant. I am only dealing with spells that I thought needed either some kind of fix or maybe some clarifications involved. And we are going to begin with Arms of Adar. Arms of Adar is a warlock spell, exclusive to warlocks, and it is an area of effect spell that does damage and has a secondary effect. But unlike other spells that deal area of effect damage and have a secondary effect, Arms of Adar seem to do a little bit less damage than all the others. So my modification to Arms of Adar is to bring it in line with the other first level spells that have a similar effect. So now, Arms of Adar, you invoke the power of Adar, the Dark Hunger. Tendrils of dark energy erupt from you and batter all creatures within 10 feet of you. Each creature in that area must make a strength saving throw. On a failed save, the target takes 2d8 necrotic damage and can't take reactions until its next turn. On a successful save, the creature takes half damage but suffers no other effects. And at higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the damage increases by 1d8 for each slot level above first. So the only changes here are to the damage. Originally, Arms of Adar did 2d6 necrotic damage and increased 1d6 per level, so we're increasing it to 2d8 and 1d8 per level. This puts it more in line with other similar spells, like Thunderwave. So Arms of Adar now is more equivalent to other first level spells that have a similar effect. The next spell I want to talk about is Burning Hands. Now Burning Hands is an area of effect spell that doesn't have a secondary effect. Also, Burning Hands, unlike other area of effect spells of this level, covers less area. It's a 15-foot cone, and that means it's going to cover 6 squares on a battlefield map, while other spells of similar nature will cover 9 squares or more. But for some reason, Burning Hands didn't do significantly more damage than those spells, and it leveled very poorly. So my adjustments now, as you hold your hands with thumbs touching and fingers spread, a thin sheet of flame shoots forth from your outstretched fingertips. Each creature in a 15-foot cone must make a dexterity saving throw. The creature takes 2d8 plus your spellcasting modifier fire damage on a failed save, or half as much damage on a successful one. The fire ignites any flammable objects in the area that aren't being worn or carried. At higher levels, when you cast a spell using a slot of 2nd level or higher, the damage increases by 1d8 for each slot level above first. So this again puts this more in line with other similar spells in that we're using d8s and that the leveling with higher level spells increases by 1d8 per level. So this will put it in line with Arms of Adar. It will put it in line with things like Thunderwave. But we'll see that this does a little bit more damage than those because we're adding our spellcasting ability modifier. That's in place of the secondary effect that those spells have. Now in terms of damage, the original Burning Hands did 3d6, so 2d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier will actually be pretty similar damage. It might be a slight amount more. The main difference here is to the leveling. But in either case, we will see that Burning Hands will do more damage than spells that cover a bigger area and have a secondary effect, as it should. That brings us to Charm Person, which I thought was one of the easiest fixes of all the first level spells I dealt with. So Charm Person, you attempt to charm a humanoid you can see within range, must make a wisdom saving throw, and it does so with advantage if you or your companions are fighting it. If it fails the saving throw, it is charmed by you until the spell ends, or until you or your companions do anything harmful to it. This is all the same. Here's the difference. The charmed creature regards you and your companions as friendly acquaintances. When the spell ends, the creature knows it was charmed by you. At higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell level of 2nd level or higher, you can target one additional creature for each slot level above first. The creatures must be within 30 feet of each other when you target them. So the only change here is when you cast Charm Person and a target is affected by it, they will treat you and your companions as friendly acquaintances, because that was the problem with Charm Person. The charm condition only does so much. It only protects you. If we're going to charm an enemy, we want them to stop attacking the party or not attack the party. And in order to do that, we needed to include our companions in the effect. That brings us to our next spell, which is Chromatic Orb. Chromatic Orb had two problems, in my opinion. The first problem was that it had a costly material component, and it's not that special a spell that it required a costly material component, in my opinion. Spells that require a costly material component should have some kind of dramatic effect. Chromatic Orb did not. It's in line with many other spells. In fact, it probably does less damage than a magic missile on average. And that was the second problem, was the damage. The damage of this spell did 3d8, and then if you cast a spell at a higher level, it added 1d8 per level. That's the same increase to damage you would expect from a Thunder Wave you cast at a higher level, except a Thunder Wave is having an area of effect. So Chromatic Orb was terrible for leveling with level, and so I wanted to change that. So first thing that happened is the material component is now just gone. It is a verbal and somatic component spell. You hurl a 4-inch diameter sphere of energy at a creature that you can see within range. You choose acid, cold, fire, lightning, poison, or thunder. If the attack hits, the creature takes 2d12 plus your spellcasting ability modifier damage of the type you chose. At higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the damage increases by 1d12 for each slot level above first. So what we're going to find is that the base damage of this spell is going to be a little bit higher than it was originally. But if we consider that we have Guiding Bolt doing 46 damage, this spell is going to be more in line with that. And Guiding Bolt has a secondary effect. But what we're going to do is we're going to scale this spell better, so if you cast it at a higher level, you're being rewarded for doing so. The next spell I want to talk about is Color Spray. So Color Spray actually mechanically works very similar to the spell Sleep, except, well, the spell Sleep makes the targets unconscious for 1 minute. Color Spray makes them blinded for 1 round. So that's a massive difference between these spells. Now, Color Spray affects 60-10 hit points worth of creatures, which is more than we get with a sleep spell, but not so dramatically more to make up for that massive difference in effect. So what I wanted to do was improve the effect of Color Spray somewhat. A dazzling ray of flashing colored light springs from your hand. Roll 60-10. The total is how many hit points of creatures the spell can affect. Creatures in a 15-foot cone originating from you are affected in ascending order of their current hit points, ignoring unconscious creatures and creatures that can't see. Starting with a creature that has the lowest current hit points, each creature affected by the spell is blinded and incapacitated until the end of your next turn. Subtract each creature's hit points from the total before moving on to the creature with the next lowest hit points. A creature's hit points must be equal to or less than the remaining total for that creature to be affected. At higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell slot of second level or higher, roll an additional 2d10 for each slot level above first. So if we compare this to sleep, sleep has the advantage of taking out your enemies for a full minute. It also has the advantage of better range. It's easier to place. We can hit more creatures with it. But Color Spray will have now the advantage of not just the additional hit points, but because the creatures are also incapacitated for a round, we're lessening the difference between the unconscious effect and what we get from a Color Spray. The next spell I want to talk about is Cure Wounds. So we all know that Healing Word is probably considered the best first level healing spell when we're in combat. And then Cure Wounds is kind of the lesser choice because Cure Wounds, although it technically cures more hit points, it requires touch, it requires a full action, and the difference isn't that much. And although Cure Wounds scales better than Healing Word, neither spell scaled nearly well enough to justify casting it with a higher level slot. And that's a little bit of a gap in the game, in my opinion, because we don't really have a lot of comparable spells of second, third, fourth, or fifth level. It's not till sixth level and we get the heal spell that we find that Cure Wounds is replaced. So what I wanted to do with Cure Wounds is make it a little bit more competitive with Healing Word at first level and make it a spell that might be worth scaling. So what I've done with Cure Wounds is a creature you touch regains a number of hit points equal to 2d6 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. The spell has no effect on undead or constructs. At higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell slot of second level or higher, the healing increases by 2d6 for each slot level above first. So we've replaced the 1d8, which is going to give us an average of 4.5, with 2d6, which is going to give us an average of 7. This means Cure Wounds is going to do significantly more healing than we would get from a Healing Word at first level, as it should. It requires touch, it requires an action. And if we scale this spell, it might be worth scaling. I still don't think that, from a tactical point of view and an optimizer's point of view, that Cure Wounds is a fantastic thing to be doing in the middle of combat, but sometimes you need it. And there was that gap in between those mid-levels where there just wasn't an effective instant cure spell. Now there's at least a moderately effective one if we are to scale our Cure Wounds, which I think was the intent of the initial rules, is that instead of having better Cure Wounds spells as we go up in level, we would just have the ability to scale our Cure Wounds spell. So now I've just improved Cure Wounds to the point where that might be effective. The next spell I want to talk about is Divine Favor. Now Divine Favor I think is best compared to spells like Hunter's Mark and Hex. Hunter's Mark and Hex each last an hour. They each add 1d6 to your damage rolls, but Divine Favor lasted for 1 minute and added 1d4 to your damage rolls. The advantage of Divine Favor over Hunter's Mark or Hex is we don't have to switch targets. We're casting it on ourselves, so we always get that bonus, and we don't have to use our bonus action every once in a while. But it still didn't quite match up because the duration was so low, because the bonus to damage was so low. Divine Favor probably just wasn't worth taking or casting. So what I've done with Divine Favor is I've kept the duration the same, but I've had the damage now fall in line with Hex and with Hunter's Mark. Your prayer empowers you with Divine Radiance until the spell ends. Your weapon attacks deal an extra 1d6 radiant damage on a hit. The next spell I want to talk about is Expeditious Retreat. Now I don't think Expeditious Retreat was a terrible spell. The one thing I found was Expeditious Retreat wasn't really about retreating. And it wasn't super effective at retreating because what would happen is you get caught in melee, you want to retreat, and then you have to use your action to disengage just so you can take your bonus action to dash. And that doesn't get you far enough away from the enemies that you have a successful retreat. So I just wanted to make it so at least we could use Expeditious Retreat for retreating effectively. So now this spell allows you to move at an incredible pace away from your enemies. When you cast a spell, and then as a bonus action on each of your turns until the spell ends, you can take the dash action. That's the same as the spell as written in the player's handbook. But I've just added in, on the turn you cast a spell, your movement does not provoke attacks of opportunity. So now if you get caught in melee, you can cast Expeditious Retreat. You can use your action to move away, and then you can use your bonus action to dash away. This will give you the distance you need to make an effective retreat, which I think was the intent of the spell. The next spell I want to talk about wasn't a bad spell. It just required a little bit of clarification. So that is the Good Berry spell. And the Good Berry spell, up to 10 berries appear in your hand and are infused with magic for the duration. Eating or administering a berry takes an action. Eating a berry restores 1 hit point, and then the berry provides enough nourishment to sustain the creature for 1 day. The berries lose their potency if they've not been consumed within 24 hours of casting this spell. So the only change I've made here is I've put eating or administering a berry. Before it was just eating a berry, which meant that by rules as written, you couldn't feed the good berry to somebody else. But Jeremy Crawford said he thought that you should be able to feed a good berry to somebody else, and that he would allow it. So then we have this conflict of the rules as they're written and the rules as they were intended. So what I've done is I've changed the rules as written so that they match the rules of intended. You can now feed the good berry to somebody else. The next spell I want to talk about is Hail of Thorns. Hail of Thorns is a ranger spell, and rangers, as we know, didn't get very much love in Player's Handbook, and I have been working to give them a little bit more love in the Treantmonk Variant. Hail of Thorns is one of those spells that seemed to be, because it was a ranger spell, it didn't quite match up with other first level spells. And I thought the fix here as well was pretty easy. And we're going to make this spell more simple to operate at your table. It's going to slow things down less and be slightly more effective. So Hail of Thorns is a bonus action cast. It's a concentration spell, so it does interfere with things like Hunter's Mark. So it is a pretty big investment. But the idea of it was that it gave the ranger something that they normally couldn't do, which was an area of effect. So now, Hail of Thorns, the next time you hit a creature with a ranged weapon attack before the spell ends, the spell creates a rain of thorns that sprouts from your ranged weapon or ammunition. In addition to the normal effects of the attack, the target of the attack and each creature within 5 feet of it takes 1d10 piercing damage. At higher levels, if you cast a spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the damage increases by 1d10 for each slot level above first. The only change I've made here is I've removed the saving throw. There used to be a saving throw for half damage. Having a bunch of creatures make saving throws to take half damage on a 1d10 damage effect slows down gameplay, doesn't make a big deal, and it just makes the spell worse than it should be. So removing that saving throw is going to make this faster to use. It's still not overly effective, but it is a bonus action spell that we're doing in conjunction with an action attack. So I think that 1d10 is okay. And if we're not worrying about a bunch of saving throws, it now effectively gives the ranger something they couldn't do before in an effective way that doesn't slow down gameplay and might be worth doing instead of a Hunter's Mark. The next spell I made a change to is Hellish Rebuke. Now, Hellish Rebuke is an okay spell when we cast it as a first level spell. What it would do is you get attacked, you use your reaction, and then you can punish the attacker with flames that did 2d10 fire damage. And then they would scale at 1d10 per level. And then they would make a saving throw to take half damage against the effect. Now what I wanted to do here is, like I said, as a first level spell I thought this worked okay. As a second and higher level spell I didn't think it worked well. And again, this is one of those spells where there's not really a lot of other spells at higher levels that have a similar effect, meaning that if you want this kind of effect, you need to be scaling this spell. So I figured this spell should scale a little bit better. So now, you point your finger, and the creature that damaged you is momentarily surrounded by hellish flames. The creature must make a dexterity saving throw. It takes 1d12 plus your spellcasting ability modifier fire damage on a failed save, or half as much damage on a successful one. In terms of average damage, that is going to probably be slightly less than the original first level Hellish Rebuke. The first level Hellish Rebuke you could probably expect to do about 11 points of damage, or half on a failed save. Now it'll probably be about 9.5 points of damage and a half on a failed save, but we're going to scale this better. So now when you cast a spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the damage increases by 1d12 for each slot level above first. So this might be a spell worth scaling. And although our damage is reduced at first level, I don't think it's reduced to the point that makes this a bad first level spell. Then we get to Identify. Identify needed something. Now, I want to make it clear that for everyone who thinks that identifies cursed items, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, under cursed items, it specifies specifically that spells like identify do not identify curses in items. So what is the use of identify? When we can just use arrest and attune to an item and figure out what it does, why do we want to use the identify spell? So I figured that we needed to give identify something to make it a worthwhile spell to cast. So the first thing I've changed here is the casting time. I am making the casting time of identify 1 action. It used to be 1 minute, or you could cast it as a ritual. Now it's 1 action, though you can still cast it as a ritual if you choose to. Now, what is the advantage of casting it as 1 action? Well, if we look at how I've changed the spell, you choose 1 object that you must touch throughout the casting of the spell. If it is a magic item or some other magic imbued object, you learn its properties and how to use them, whether it requires attunement to use, and how many charges it has, if any. You learn whether any spells are affecting the item and what they are. If the item was created by a spell, you learn which spell created it. If the object requires attunement, you may attune to it immediately. The spell cannot detect a curse within a magic item. If you instead touch a creature throughout the casting, you learn what spells, if any, are currently affecting it. So the changes here I've made are you can cast it as an action, and you can use that action to attune to the item. So this gives an advantage to the identify spell, because if we find a magic item, you can attune to it with 1 action. That might be worth your first level slot. The other change I've made to the text, though not to the effect of the spell, is I have specified within the identify spell, the spell cannot detect a curse within a magic item. Again, this isn't a change to the rules, but it caused massive confusion that identify didn't say that in the spell description, but it did say that in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So I've included it in the spell description, and that should avoid some confusion. The next spell I want to talk about is a losery script. Now, losery script is a very circumstantial spell, and I just found it didn't quite match up to what I thought it should be able to do, but I didn't want to make it a powerful spell. It is a circumstantial spell. I want it to remain a circumstantial spell. So now, with a losery script, this is a casting time of 1 minute or cast as a ritual. You write on parchment, paper, or some other suitable writing material and imbue it with a potent illusion that lasts for the duration. To you and any other creatures you designate when you cast a spell, the writing appears normal, written in your hand, and conveys whatever meaning you intended when you wrote the text. This is the same as the player's handbook. To all others, the writing is invisible. This is a change. This is the change I've made to this spell. Alternatively, you can cause the writing to appear to be an entirely different message, written in a different hand and language, though the language must be one you know. Should the spell be dispelled, the original script and the illusion both disappear. A creature with true sight can read the hidden message. So the only change I've made here is that we can make the message completely invisible. I think this is a significant advantage in the circumstances where this spell is useful. You want to send a hidden message to your allies. The best way to do that is to have the message not appear to anybody else at all. If an enemy or somebody we're concerned about see some script and they don't understand the message, they might investigate further. If the message is invisible, that is less likely to occur. So that brings us to the next spell, which is Jump. Now, Jump is a very circumstantial spell. I'm not sure it's a great spell, but I can see some uses for it because it is only first level, because we don't have a lot of effects that allow us climbing, we don't have a lot of effects that allow us flight at this point. Jump still has use in the game, so I thought I would like to boost it a little bit, but I didn't want to go crazy here. So what I've done is you touch a creature. The creature's jump distance is tripled until the spell ends, and their jumping distance is not reduced for making standing, long, or high jumps. This is very similar to the original spell. The only change I've made is that their jumping distance is not reduced for making standing, long, or high jumps. This just adds a little bit of flexibility to the spell, so this is a small bump. Then we get to a spell that I thought needed a bigger bump, and that is Ray of Sickness. So Ray of Sickness was a spell that you cast it had a single target, you make it to hit roll. That to hit roll did 2d8 points of damage, which is significantly less than we would expect from a single target damage spell. And then they would get a saving throw that was Constitution, which is the worst save to target, and if they failed that saving throw, they were poisoned for 1 round. That's terrible for a first level spell. So I knew this spell needed something to make it worthwhile. And this is what I've done. A ray of sickening greenish energy lashes out towards a creature within range and explodes in a nauseous gas upon impact. Make a ranged spell attack against the target. On a hit, the target takes 2d8 poison damage. The target of the attack and each creature within 5 feet of it must make a Constitution saving throw or be poisoned until the end of your next turn. At higher levels, when you cast this spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the damage increases by 1d8 for each slot level above 1st. So I'm keeping the damage of this spell the same, but I'm improving the secondary effect of this spell. So now, number 1, the target doesn't need to be hit in order to get the secondary effect, and the spell will now have a small area of effect, where we might have a minor effect on a group of enemies. So this will improve Ray of Sickness significantly, because number 1, we don't need to hit and have a target fail their saving throw, and number 2, we can affect multiple creatures with it. I think this brings Ray of Sickness in line with other spells of first level. That brings us to our next spell, which is Searing Smite. So paladins have a number of what we call smite spells. They use the paladin's concentration and a bonus action, and they usually deliver some extra damage and a secondary effect. Generally speaking, we consider these spells to be weak spells. There are exceptions. Spells like Wrathful Smite, which we will not see on this list, are already good smite spells. But Searing Smite and Thunderous Might are. So now with Searing Smite, this is the change I've made. The next time you hit a creature with a melee weapon attack during the spell's duration, your weapon flares with white-hot intensity, exploding in searing heat when you strike, and the attack deals an additional 1d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier in fire damage to the target, and the searing heat erupts to creatures of your choice that you can see within 5 feet of it, inflicting your spellcasting ability modifier in fire damage. At higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the extra damage dealt to the initial target of the attack increases by 1d8 for each slot. So, number 1, what I'm doing is kind of a template for these smite spells that have a minor secondary effect. Spells like Searing Smite, spells like Thunderous Smite. We are going to be using d8s for damage. This is going to be in line with the actual smite ability. We do not want smite spells to be able to scale faster than actual smites, but if we are going to scale them, they should scale at a similar rate. So with a 1d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier base damage, and then an increase of 1d8 damage per spell level, this will do less damage than if we had just used the spell slot on a smite, and it will use our bonus action, and it will use our concentration. But we are getting a decent secondary effect, and it will scale at the same rate as an actual smite. Now, original Searing Smite had an extended duration effect that used your concentration to deliver 1d6 points of damage, perhaps, per round. That isn't worth your concentration. But in this case, what we're doing is we're just having a better initial effect, where we can do an area of effect damage. Note, and this is definitely intentional, is that if we are scaling this spell, the damage to the secondary targets does not scale. Which brings us to our other smite spell, Thunderous Smite. Once again, bonus action, concentration. The first time you hit with a melee weapon attack during the spell's duration, your weapon rings with thunder that is audible within 300 feet of you. And the attack deals an additional 1d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier thunder damage to the target. Now, Thunderous Smite used to do 2d6 thunder damage instead of 1d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. The damage is going to end up being similar, but this is going to work better for us in terms of scaling this spell. Additionally, if the target is a creature, it must succeed on a strength saving throw or be knocked prone, and if you choose, is knocked 10 feet away from you. Before, it would knock the creature 10 feet away from you and knock it prone. This isn't always what you want to do, because sometimes you don't want the creature to be knocked 10 feet of you and be out of your weapon's range. So we're going to make that an option for you. The creature will be knocked prone if they fail their saving throw, but the knockaway effect is now your choice. We can explain this thematically very easily. If we're attacking the creature with a side attack, then it will be knocked away, but if we are coming with a slash from the top down, then the thunderous effect just pushes the target straight down. The final change I'm making to this spell is I'm going to let this spell scale, like other smite spells can scale. There wasn't really a reason why this one was excluded. I assume it might have been an oversight because there's not really an additional bonus to scaling this spell over any other smite spell, so I've included scaling for this spell. At higher levels, when you cast a spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the extra damage dealt by the attack increases by 1d8 for each slot, the same as we're going to get with other smite spells. So the final spell I want to talk about is Witch Bolt. So Witch Bolt in the player's handbook, this is what it did. You would cast a spell at a creature within 30 feet. You would make it a hit roll. If the spell hit, you did 1d12 damage. You then had to use your concentration, and on following rounds, you would use your action to deliver an additional 1d12 points of damage to the creature. Then if you scaled the spell, what would happen is the damage of the initial effect would increase by 1d12, but the damage on subsequent turns would not increase. And finally, if the creature was to move out of the effect while you're concentrating, the spell would end. So this was a spell that was ripe with problems. The first thing is that if we're talking about a spell that requires it to hit roll and does damage to a single target, 1d12 simply was not in line with anything else at this level. Then we had the problem that on additional rounds we're using our concentration just to deliver another 1d12 damage, which frankly again I'm not certain was worth it. But of course a creature could just move out of the area. 30 feet isn't a long range to get out of. And then we would simply lose the spell. And then if we scaled, imagine for a moment that you're, say, a 7th level caster, and you scale this to 4th level. Well, you would do 4d12 on the initial attack, and then on subsequent rounds, you do 1d12 damage using your action and your concentration with a 7th level character. So Witch Bolt became irrelevant after 1st level, and at 1st level it wasn't very good either. So my first thought about fixing this spell was, how do I get the damage in line with where it should be? I figured, number 1, the damage from the initial attack should be better. And number 2, the damage from subsequent rounds should be better. How do we make that happen without it being overpowered? But then that brought along the second problem, which is creatures can just move out of the area. So then I thought maybe I could increase the range of it and increase the damage. And then it seemed to move away from the way I envisioned the spell, because the way I envisioned the spell is a little bit like the Emperor using Force Lightning on Luke or whatever in the Star Wars movies. That's, I think, essentially what Witch Bolt is based on. They describe it as a beam of crackling blue energy. So when I reviewed those scenes in the movies, it made it clear to me what I needed to do here. It wasn't a matter of the initial damage. It was a matter of imposing a secondary effect. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to impose a secondary effect, and I wanted to have it so that if we scale this with level, we wouldn't pile all the extra damage on the first round, but instead the extra damage would extend throughout the duration of the spell. So now, Witch Bolt. Casting time, range, components, duration all remain the same. A beam of crackling blue energy lances towards a creature within range, forming a sustained arc of lightning between you and the target. On a hit, a target takes 1d8 lightning damage plus your spellcasting ability modifier, and it makes a Constitution saving throw. On a failed save, its speed is reduced to 0 until the spell ends. On each of your turns for the duration, you can use your action to deal 1d8 lightning damage plus your spellcasting ability modifier to the target automatically. The spell ends if you use your action to do anything else. The spell also ends if the target is ever outside the spell's range or has total cover from you. At higher levels, when you cast this spell using a spell slot of 2nd level or higher, the damage increases by 1d8 for each slot level above 1st. So we have altered the damage somewhat. Instead of a d12, we're going to use a d8 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. This is not going to make a big difference in the initial damage or the extended damage, but what it does do is it allows us to be using the d8 for scaling. So now when we look at higher levels, I can add a d8. It's going to add to your initial attack, which will be less than the initial scaling, but it will add d8 to your additional rounds, which will add more to the scaling. And if we can extend a Witch Bolt, then it will do more damage. But the main thing is the secondary effect. This is what's going to make this spell effective. If a creature fails a saving throw, its speed reduces to 0. This gives us a control effect. Now, keep in mind that you have to hit, and then they have to fail a Constitution saving throw. So this isn't easy to set up. But if you do set it up, then what we have is this wonderful situation where we have an enemy that's locked down, and you can just zap it and zap it and zap it like the Emperor until either you are stopped or the enemy is defeated. So those are the changes I made to Witch Bolt. That was a more dramatic change. And that is first level spells. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Next week I will talk about second level spells. And until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. Because D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone, and I hope to see you next week.